千里之行，始于足下. A journey of 1,000 miles begins beneath the feet. We now gather in the Tao to travel the journey together. Welcome to Tao Talks with Derek Lin, where we take a deep dive into the Daodejing by Lao Zi. I would like to invite you to center your thoughts and direct your attention to this moment in time, to the here and now. To be fully present and mindfully aware as we all ready ourselves for this sacred process of the Tao. So the two kinds of virtue, there's the virtue of prosperity, and then there's the virtue of merit. 福德, the first two characters here, 福德 literally means virtue of prosperity, where the first character is prosperity or abundance, and then the second character is virtue. The character in the middle means and, A-N-D, and then the last two characters, 功德. 功德 is the virtue of merit. So what is the difference between the virtue of prosperity and the virtue of merit? Let's find out. I've got two columns here. On the left, the virtue of prosperity. Remember, that's 福德. And then on the right, we've got 功德, the virtue of merit. The virtue of prosperity is what happens when you interact with people, when you interact with the world. Therefore, it is externally directed. It's what you do in the world. Conversely, the virtue of merit is what happens internally. That's what happens in the heart, in the mind, in the spirit. It's internally directed. When you do a good deed, that's external. When you reflect upon the Tao teachings and arrive at an epiphany, that's internal. Okay, so you can accumulate virtues in different ways. Doing a good deed is a virtue of prosperity. Having a realization, having awakening, enlightened consciousness, that's the virtue of merit. So external versus internal. Therefore, the externally directed virtue of prosperity, 福德, it has to do with the material world. And the method of interaction is material in nature. Like material assistance. I give you something that will help you. That would be material assistance. Whereas the virtue of merit is in the intangible spiritual realm. It's about spirituality versus the material world. So it's the tangible versus the intangible. Things versus thoughts. Now, the virtue of prosperity. In the Zen Buddhist tradition, it is pointed out that this is ultimately illusory. Why? Well, because the material world itself, everything in it, everyone in it, the fleshly bodies that we inhabit, the things that we use, all the physical objects, they are all impermanent and transient. They keep changing, they come and go. They are here and then they are gone. Like a candle flame that flickers in and then goes out. So ultimately, it is as if they are unreal, that they don't really exist. They're transients, they are illusory. Conversely, the intangible is ultimately real. In this unreal world, the only real thing are the spiritual selves, the true nature, the self nature, the true self. We individually, although we're not able to really categorize or explain or point to it or hold on to it, you can't contain something like the soul, it is ultimately real in a world that is ultimately illusory. So if you do something good, if you do a good deed, if you give something great to someone that's very helpful, that's great. But recognize that it's all transient. You must also pay attention to the merit that when you accumulate that, it is what you refine in your spirit, and therefore it is what you keep. So furthermore examples, because the virtue of prosperity is all about dealing with other people, dealing with the world, it's what happens when you see the suffering of others. That's sensory input. That's when you look at things and then you feel compassion. The looking of it, the observing of it, that's your interaction with the material world. What about internal? Well, it is said in the Zen Buddhist tradition, and this is very true, that when you are able to see the truth of self-nature, when you look at all this, and when you begin to understand that, wow, ultimately, this individualness, this me-ness that I can't really define, more than anything else that I touch, that I use in the material world, this is what's real. When you are able to see that truth, when you are able to comprehend it and become one with it, that's the virtue of merit. Now, just looking at these two, you can see that it's not a question of one or the other. In the third bullet here, when I say ultimately illusory and ultimately real, you may think, as I did many, many years ago, that, oh yeah, well, we should discount the virtue of prosperity and focus on the virtue of merit. That is the misconception that I had. When I get to the fourth bullet, my realization is that we gotta have both. We must cultivate both the virtue of prosperity and the virtue of merit. We cannot be indifferent to the suffering of others. We cannot neglect the practice to see the truth of self-nature. Both sides, both columns are actually necessary. They actually feed into each other. So further examples of that, when you give to charity, that's the virtue of prosperity. Why? Well, it's the external world, it's material. And note that because it is tied to the material world, giving to charity can be categorized into doing it for selfless, natural compassion, or it can also be done in a way as to further one's own personal glory. So it can be positive or negative by itself because it's tied to the material world. So then, instead of just the giving to charity, which is giving of something material, on the virtue of merit side, it is all about the natural compassion that you cultivate when you have practiced your virtues, the virtue of compassion, and being compassionate becomes second nature to you. This bullet point is also where you can see how the two sides can feed into one another, can support one another, and be dependent on one another. Feeling the natural flow of compassion from the heart can inspire one to give to charity. Then it goes from the inside, it goes from the heart to the outside, to the world. When you see the giving to charity, when you see the suffering of poverty, that can inspire the natural flow of compassion within. Thus, the two sides are complementary dualities. So then, giving to charity is related to this bullet here, support religious practice. So this is what one ancient emperor, Liang Wudi, had done. He supported the religious practice of his time, which was Buddhism. He built hundreds of temples. He supported thousands of monks, and he looked to that as virtue, except he, at the time, did not know the difference between Fūde and Gongde, prosperity versus merit. So supporting religious practice is external to yourself, whereas a focus on self-cultivation is internally directed. So I think you begin to really get, I think you're comfortable now with the difference between the two. There is no doubt that external support of charity or religious practice can be a valuable contribution to society. No doubt about that. You help relieve the suffering of sentient beings. That's worthy of commendation, worthy of praise. But look on the right side. The right side is the path where you cultivate for the priceless Tao. The valuable contribution I'm talking about on the left-hand side, oftentimes people will put a number on it. Example, a philanthropist has given $1 million to a charitable organization. That 1 million, that one with the following zeros, that's a number. Whereas cultivating for the priceless Tao, can't put a price tag on it. Overall, as I mentioned, it's actually the yin and yang of virtues. So the virtue, this whole concept of virtue is composed of both the external and the internal. It's got to be done in the material world, but also internally, spiritually. Part of it is ultimately illusory. That doesn't mean we don't do it. And it has to do with how they evolve into one another, that they circle one another and transform from one to the other. So as I said, the distinction between the two is often taught in authentic traditions in Asia, but usually never mentioned in the West. Enlightened cultivators of the Tao engage in both kinds of virtues. They do not let one side obscure the other. Our meeting has come to an end, but the journey continues on. Let us all travel safely so we can meet again. Until next time, may the Tao fill you with peace and happiness.